You're live.
We are live. Senate Transportation. It is Thursday, March 21st. We have moved on from the T-bill, and we're going to talk about the lease renewal for the Washington County Railroad with our Director of Rail and other things. Welcome, Dan.
Good morning.
Looks like you're up in the clouds and flying in one of your planes.
No, just sitting in my office here. Yes, good morning. For the record, yeah, I'm Dan Delabriere, Rail and Aviation Bureau Director for the Agency of Transportation. So this morning, wanted to talk about, we are at the point where we have to do a renewal for the operating agreement with the Washington County Railroad, which is the line that runs directly out in front of the State House from Montpelier Junction up to Graniteville. That lease agreement was signed with the railroad in 1999, and it's due to expire this June. So we're at the point where we have to renew it. That line, when we bought it in 1980, when it was sort of going under, struggled for years.
Dan, who owned it when we bought it?
We bought it, I think so it's interesting because that line it consisted of 3 different railroads. When we bought it, we bought different sections of it from different railroads. So there wasn't just one owner, and which is, if you remember a couple of years ago, we did the runaround track. So that was actually a piece of property that was owned by a different railroad. So we were able to move the track over there because when we bought all those railroad properties, we had different lines of the track. So I don't remember which railroads they were when we bought them, but we bought them basically between 1980 and through 1999.
And it wasn't really being used much at the time.
It was still considered operational, but it was deteriorating every year. So trains were still able to operate, just it was getting bad.
Okay.
And first offered or approached, this was before my time, by the way, but the history that I was told, we approached New England Central because that's where it connects in Montpelier Junction. New England Central didn't have a lot of enthusiasm or wanting to operate that line back then. So there's not a lot of people banging down the door to operate from Montpelier Junction to Graniteville because while there is freight traffic, it's not a huge money maker. So
and it's there's basically only one customer.
There's 3 really, 4 sometimes.
Are they all doing granite?
No.
Yeah.
No. There's fuel, there's lumber, there's granite coming in, granite going out. So obviously the big customer is up on the hill, right? The aggregate up on the hill is the big customer. That's the big mover. But there are
the lumber yard, so they were bringing in, before it burnt down, they were bringing in, maybe at Boltonberry and Montpelier, there's 2 lumber yards where train goes through there. And I know there's a pellet company that brings in some pellets by train and then just parks the car there and feeds off of that.
Right. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Okay. And then there's also, you remember the Bombardier plant was up on the hill a while ago. That's still being used occasionally for restoration of rail cars and things. So like I say, there's sort of some full-time customers and then there's some part-time customers. So it's still a valid rail line in my mind. And it's actually growing with the granite business up on the hill and marketing further away, long distance for the aggregate.
Yeah,
The line seems to be, growing.
yeah, there seems to be more action on it.
Yeah, and the actual infrastructure itself is probably in the best shape it's been since we've owned it now. Um, Partially because of some of the reconstruction we just did with the flood, but I
Part of
would say as far as infrastructure goes, we're in the best spot we've been in.
that's part of the lease deal because they're required to do that maintenance. I
Well,
remember.
so that's the one of the things about the agreement is when there's a natural disaster, language, and this is one of the things we want to. Did you get them? Did you get the memo of the proposed language going
I did get
in?
the memo, the email. Megan sent it out to us. I don't know if people looked at it. We have a hard copy. Um, I don't know if you guys, I mean, I looked at it really quickly, but
Okay, the reason why I ask that is because kind of the last sentence in that language is as well as language updating and clarifying certain provisions of the existing agreement. There's a few things that we've been working on with Washington County Railroad, other than just the date or extending the 3 10-year renewals. There's, we think because of all this investment we've made, it's time to phase this operating subsidy out. Because the whole reason for that operating subsidy was because the track and the condition of that whole rail line was in such disrepair when they started operating it, and there weren't as many customers as we have now, that we basically subsidized that railroad so that they could get up and running. And it worked, right? I mean, we know that there's more customers today than ever and that the track is in better shape than it's ever been. So it's a success story, but we think at VTrans that it's time for the subsidy to be phased out and go away. They should be able to operate kind of on their own now. But the other piece in that last language, which we want to clarify, so when we had the disaster in July, there's what's called a force majeure clause in there, basically that says if it's an act of God, something that the railroad didn't cause, it wasn't a maintenance issue, then VTrans sort of steps in and we take over the repairs based on the flood damage, and then we're eligible to go and seek FEMA funding through their public assistance program. So that's one of the things that we want to just tighten up the language on, because FEMA actually questioned it, and there was a couple of buzzwords that we were okay. I mean, we got the FEMA money, but they want us to tighten that language up in our agreement and clarify that it's not maintenance.
okay. Senator Chinden has a question.
So Dan, I see two things on our website, and they're two different, but I don't see anything about force majeure. And I guess I have more questions about what you referenced or what it's posted as regarding the Washington rail yard, but it really looks like all state-owned railroads, eliminating the need to go to the governor and the General Assembly, and instead just empowering the secretary to renew all of these.
Yeah, there's two different things.
Okay, yeah, so that's the other memo.
Mention a third thing that I don't see. I don't see the force majeure anywhere.
No, so okay, so I was bringing that up because in that first one, if you look at the last sentence, it says as well as language updating and clarifying certain provisions of the existing agreement. I just wanted to give you guys a heads up on what that means, and that is we're going to tweak a couple of words in the existing agreement to just take out any ambiguity or any confusion on force majeure versus maintenance. And it's a tweak. It exists now. We just wanted to make it a little more clear.
That helps. Thank you.
I guess my overall question though is, are you're asking to renew the lease with Washington County Railroad without kind of going out to bid, right? Like you're not going to do a new bid, which I assume was done when we signed it before, whatever that was, 1990 or whatever. Is there any value in going out to bid should we?
So if you look at how railroads operate, it would be, there's nobody banging down the door to take over that railroad, even including New England Central, who would be the only other kind of partner that we deal with. Have we gone out to bid? No. If we go out to bid, my prediction is, this is just a prediction. I don't have a crystal ball. My prediction would be, based on the railroads that I know and work with every day, no one would likely bid on that.
Not even Washington.
And well, I think Washington County, they've established some businesses there, so they would probably be the only one.
So I'm not seeing language on the changing of the incentive. Where is that?
Okay, so that's what I was saying. So at the end, it says, in language updating and clarifying certain provisions. The provisions that we want to update are just tweaking the force majeure language, and
it's in the lease agreement, not the statute.
It's in the lease agreement, and eliminating the subsidy so that we know VTrans, the state, we no longer subsidize the operation of that railroad.
And if I remember correctly, you guys, and I guess you or we, the state and Washington County Railroad, consider the lease a private document that's not available for the public?
Yeah, the railroad's legal team definitely, well, we'd have to redact some stuff because there's some specific stuff to their business in there.
Right. Because I think that I've gotten some people have wanted to see the lease, and I think I've asked you before, and you said, well, it's not available. And
it's not a public document.
Well, it could be with a lot of redactions in it, but there's some proprietary information in there to the railroad.
Just about them, about their costs of running it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in statute about what needs to be in the lease. You guys just negotiated that lease, trying to get the best deal for the state that you could and make.
Yeah. So, and what we're talking about here is taking that existing lease that was from 1999, keeping that existing lease for 30 more years with a couple of tweaks. One is, let's stop paying for the subsidy.
Yeah.
So,
good.
And let's protect the force majeure clause so that if there is a disaster, the state's not on the hook for all of the costs. We get federal reimbursement from FEMA. So we're trying to just tighten that up to protect the state on that. And we're trying to, again, not subsidize the operational cost.
Is this issue with the lease having to be redacted to show it, would that be the same for any other leases that the state has, like airports or?
Well, we don't have, no, those are different. I mean, again, similar, I guess, but not as much individual business detail. Those are fairly generic template leases. Okay. This is not a generic lease. This is specific.
Okay.
Well, I'm just wondering, so right now we're actually subsidizing. So we've funded all the improvements and we're subsidizing the operation. Under a new lease, then there would be no subsidy. Would they be paying anything at all for the use of the rail?
So that's the part we gotta figure out. Take out the subsidy and add in a clause which is similar to the other leases, is based on their revenue on that rail line. At what point, and there's different levels, like, so triggers at different economic income levels. Once they reach a certain point, they pay the state X amount of dollars. Once they reach the next level, they pay X more dollars. That's what we have in all the other leases. revenue is generated based on our state revenue is based on their railroad income for that line. That's what we want to change. We want to make this lease look more like the other leases.
And are we getting paid with those other leases? Like they hit those revenue targets that require payment?
Yes.
But this one hasn't, and partly because we're kind of backing out the maintenance costs.
Well, this one hasn't because, I mean, we had a rail line that had business that was falling off,
Right.
and we had maintenance that had been deferred. So we literally had to pay a railroad to operate there just to survive, and it worked. I mean, whoever put that together in 1999, I would say pat them on the back. They did a good job. That's a railroad that probably would have died. It didn't. It serves Vermont. The rock up on the hill is a huge asset to all of New England and Vermont. And whoever had their crystal ball out, I thought that pat them on the back. They did a good job.
Okay. So there should.
I don't want to jump the gun, but I'm more interested in talking about this second memo about the lease for continued operation. Did you want to say anything about that before I ask a question?
No, I think we're sort of a conversation starter on that. We don't have, we're at the beginning. We just wanted to bring that up, just as context with this one, because as we were looking at renewing this lease or extending this lease, we were like, well, why does this lease or operating agreement have to do that when all our other leases don't? Like we do lease railroad property.
Of the governor, et cetera.
In the General Assembly, and if the General Assembly is not in session, it's a special committee.
I just wanted to make sure that was what I was, is that approval and language by all those entities. And that doesn't exist with the others.
It only exists with railroad operating agreements. It does exist with the VTR and the Green Mountain and the other Washington County. Yeah, so if we have those renewals, we have to come to you guys. But any other lease that VTrans works with at the airports or even on some of these railroads, like we lease excess property to some businesses or utilities or whatever up and down the rail line, those aren't required to come in front of you. It's really only the operating lease with the railroad. So the question was, why are these different? And this is an opening discussion. I don't know that VTrans is hard and fast on this. We were just like, why is this different?
I haven't got a clue.
So my question would be, before I will have to present this on the floor and support it, I'd want to just normalize, especially with our chair of institutions, that this doesn't rub you the wrong way, taking away the authority and oversight of the governor, the General Assembly, and the special committee. So this is common practice across government and also government ops. I'd be curious if they have any reactions to that.
Probably BGS would be the best source to just say, is this something that is unique? And what you're also saying is any of the leases that occur in other places, I don't know, like airports or hangars or whatever, this is just unique to rail leases.
Rail operating agreements, which is a lease. Well, it's a lease operating agreement. It's kind of one in the same. We just use these words interchangeable.
The only other thing, in looking, public would say, well, is this a sweetheart deal? And you can say, well, we kind of, assess, we don't think there's any interest. Should we, in fact, do some, I know in the state, we have something called a modified bid process where you just sort of say, this is under, and submit, a letter of interest. It seems to me that gives you some protection that in fact you haven't done something, in the back room kind of agreement, and it would just validate the assumption and alleviate any kind of risk that an entity would say, wow, we would have been very interested but weren't given the opportunity. I just throw that out as something for us to feel that the public interest and investment was protected. And so that's my thought, is not to make it elaborate, but even if it meant some kind of less complicated. And the only example I can think of is what we do with other contracts. So I throw that out to the committee.
Do you, Dan or Michelle, know that you guys have to follow 3.5? I see that bulletin 3.5 that the administration has.
That's a
For leasing.
contract though. Is it for leases too?
Well, it's contracts and grants, so it's 3.5. I assume a lease would be involved in that. So I don't know.
I'd have to ask our group.
Because in there you would be required to at least do the simplified bid.
Right.
I don't know if you would go and ask for a waiver or.
Or if 3.5 doesn't apply to leases, then the question is, can we use that as a, as a model?
Well, I would just say that whenever we do leases for airport property or excess railroad property, I mean, we don't go out to bid and say, okay, we have a little piece of land here, who wants it, and bid it. I mean, we enter into leases all the time without doing.
It seems like if you could get around all of the requirements in Bolton 3.5 by just calling it a lease, we would have a lot more leases.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And I think that, if the secretary wanted to go out and lease a building to do an operation in, he doesn't have to get the approval of the legislature.
No, yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm just
Yeah,
wondering
it's
about
different.
following.
Private entity having the benefit of a publicly
Yes, I see.
financed asset
Yeah.
to operate their business is
Yeah.
a kind of a unique quality. And I don't know what the investment now is in this line, but it's fairly substantial after the crossings and the upgrade. And so to me, it's protecting a state-owned asset and making sure that we are, I can just hear one of our colleagues say the state always buys high and sells low, and engages in agreements that are not to the advantage of the state. I mean, we get that, and I think we need to be sensitive that we don't open ourselves up to those kinds of, or we in fact didn't know of some entity that might be interested and would say, you never gave us an opportunity. It's like a pre-select on a hire. And that runs into obviously sometimes difficulties. That's really what it's running through my mind about how we could do it, not make it horribly complicated, but give assurances that the public interest and the public investment was foremost in anything that's agreed to.
So if you guys can check with Secretary Klaus or whoever your liaison is over there to see if like this falls within Bolton 3.5, because then we'd have all those protections.
Absolutely.
And you basically need the approval of the governor. So that would be good to know, but I don't see a big problem with putting this in the T-bill once we get it.
But even if it's not subject to 3.5, I still think we need to have something comparable for something of an investment of this magnitude, and for the economic benefit for a specific entity, which is, to me, where you would get perhaps some questioning on the part of the public or some interest group.
Especially if the lease is not viewable by the public. That makes it even more suspect. Like, there wasn't a bid.
Yeah.
You can't look at the lease.
It
And it's
doesn't,
for 30 years.
do you want to defend that? I would find it puts, I think it raises a host of concerns.
Those are all really valid points, and I think we can certainly come back to you with some additional information, and perhaps what we find will also inform the second piece of language that we put up for discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Great, thanks.
Good to see you, Dan.
We'll be in
Good
touch.
to see you guys, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Over to our favorite topic, right-of-way
Oh,
usage fees. How many times have we had Rob White? He's like the most frequent flyer this And we brought this up because what? I forgot.
So
We're at one point we were gonna look at the House bill.
I'm looking at this letter from the auditor. I believe this is the
Oh, yeah.
context. I think we've all seen it before. and I just don't feel like it's been resolved in my mind. And I understand the House is looking at things as well. I just haven't seen the findings demonstrating why we aren't collecting this fee in writing as the statute states. And that, I fear like this was suggested to raise between $1 and $4 million if we need money, so that's why it's still an open question to me. But I understand there's been lots of conversations in the House, so maybe this has been resolved, and I'm just not in the loop yet.
How did we come our way?
It was pulled out at the last minute, if I'm not mistaken.
These were pulled out, right? And maybe that's why maybe people thought you would just explain kind of what happened. And I think you've already.
And Ways and
explained
Means
the
must have pulled it
administration.
out.
These were taken out.
Yeah, environmental and energy pulled it out, I believe, ultimately. So I'd love to, for the record, Rob White, Project Delivery Bureau Director at the Agency of Transportation. I'd love to give, I'll try to be brief, brief history of how this whole thing has gone down. You know, this started, this existing statute came into place in 2007. My understanding is, and at that time, it makes me feel a little bit old, but at that time I was the right-of-way chief for the first year of my time there as the right-of-way chief. But that bill came up. It's my understanding that it never came to any of the transportation committees.
It came out of Commerce at Vince Saluzzi, and it was really around broadband.
Right, and so I don't think we ever did a bill review. We never even realized that the statute even went into place until fast forward to around 2013, which is about the time that we were starting to get some energy projects were coming our way. The TDI project that I've mentioned before, which is that line that was on the western side of the state, was in our purview at that time. We were getting a lot of information about cell towers. Companies were coming saying they were going to build hundreds of them, be ready, you know. So we had that we were looking into. And we are also thinking about wired lines, telecommunication lines. And interesting enough, the TDI project actually had like 144 strands of fiber optic, and they needed like 8. And part of the deal was we were going to get their dark fiber, you know. So we were thinking about fiber optic on sort of 2 levels there. So there was a committee. You probably have heard the FOT. That was the name that came up. I think it was Scott Rogers that came up with that name, if you remember Scott. The Public Service Department was a part of that committee. Executives in the agency, and they were looking at these sorts of issues, like what are we going to do? How are we going to manage these things? Are we going to charge? Out of that, and I didn't bring handouts for anybody, but I was just trying to jog my memory. But out of that, we hired an appraiser, a specialty appraiser to actually, that I believe did some work for New York, similarly. Wrote an appraisal to basically give us a better understanding for this electric project, as well as.
That's the one I was going to go through Lake Champlain.
Yes.
And you actually budgeted the money in your.
I was hoping you aren't going to bring that up like you did previously in testimony, but you are correct. We budgeted the money without actually having it in hand. We were.
Anticipatory optimism.
So we got this appraisal. And this was actually much more than an appraisal. This actually sort of set up the framework for charging telecommunication providers. It looked at various population levels. It had a 2-tier approach. It looked at them at the town level. It had escalator clauses for, you know, over certain years. And, you know, I can tell you that, you know, here's the chart that we're in, you know, 2024. Here's the chart to escalate those fair market value charges. And ultimately, the committee felt like, here's this energy project. It's with one individual. It's going to be one lease, and it's going to generate, to start, it was estimated to be $4 million in year 1 and have an escalator clause for 40 years. It was a lot of money. We had cell towers, which we didn't have a lot here in the state at the time, but we did have a few. We already had some leases in place. There's an antenna in the cupola of the Williston rest area that has been paying leases since they've been there. So we had some good experience with that. fairly simple, already sort of stood up. So we sort of focused on that, and we got an additive to this on cell tower fair market value that we did in-house.
Later,
Huh?
a year later, years later.
A few years later.
What are the dates of those reports?
This one is 2015. And the one for towers was done in 2017. And then when we looked at the telecommunication piece, it was extensive. We didn't really, I mean, we knew we had a lot of wired lines in our right of ways, but we didn't really know how many were telecommunication, how many were not, which one should be waived, which ones should not. There was a lot of questions. There's overhead lines, underground lines. Were we talking just fiber? Some of those are still copper. You know, there was a lot of questions at hand. And, you know, at the end of the day, we didn't, and this spans two administrations, the Shumlin administration and the Scott administration, both of them very focused on telecommunication and expansion across the state. At that time, we didn't really want to pass on a lot of cost to ratepayers. So we looked really closely at the statute that was in play. I will say, you know, I think there's a lot of different perspective on what this actually means, this statute, because in the first paragraph, it talks about fair market value, and the state shall charge folks, except for what's noted in section B, which talks about a reasonable rate, and that it's at the discretion of the agency on what that right rate may or may not be. So at least at that time, we decided that we've got two statutes. Well, let me back up. We didn't have the second statute yet. At that point, we felt like we didn't want to pass on those costs to the ratepayers. We considered going to a lower amount than the just compensation that we've determined. When we ran those numbers, we were barely going to break even to stand this program up and actually collect the revenue. So we decided, look, we're going to say the reasonable rate is 0, and we're going to put in our 1111 permits this sort of clause that says we can charge, but we're not going to right now, but we may decide to in the future. So that's how we put that aside, and then we focused on cell towers and energy projects. The energy projects have sort of come and gone.
You jinxed it by putting in your bed.
I guess so. And then the towers just never came. We had a few show up, but nothing really on our property. A lot of it was more in the metropolitan areas, on regular poles, micro cell towers and stuff like that. So we didn't really see the big towers that we were thinking of. I believe the letter that came from the auditor is from 2022. And it questions the statute. I believe and I don't think the letter was necessarily directed to V-Trans, was it, or was it? Yeah, it
So
came,
that's, but V-Trans didn't had responses to it.
I haven't seen that. I'm asking for it. Would love to see that response.
so I don't believe there was any formal response.
Oh,
I believe we drafted a response, but it never actually went to the auditors, is my understanding. That's
maybe
my
I'm
understanding.
thinking about the paving report. There was the whole list of responses. Okay.
Yeah.
So
So that's why I keep raising this, is I just haven't seen that response. And if you look at the last section here, therefore, the agency, this is in statute, may extend any waiver granted for an additional period not to exceed 5 years if the agency makes affirmative written findings demonstrating that the state has received and will continue to receive value that is comparable to the value to the provider of the waiver, or it may revise. Either we should change the statute, or we should
They're
respond.
saying they didn't use the waiver, they did a reasonable fee, and the reasonable fee was 0.
Would you agree that that is worth considering or
Yeah.
challenging?
Who would they
'Cause
send
that's
the
not a
written-
reasonable fee. It's not a fee.
who do they send the determination to again?
I think the two transportation committees,
Yeah.
In other words, if you made a determination to waive, who do you send your written determination to?
I'd like to just go to the auditor right now. I feel like he sent this to us. I don't want to drop the ball, and I feel like something is not happening that should be happening. Either change the statute, respond to it in written format, or
Well-
start collecting a fee. But what do I know?
And if I could jump ahead just to the language that has been proposed, that it has been struck, but my understanding is that it will come back with an amendment on the floor. That's my understanding.
In the House.
In the House. It's interesting to note that the numbers that they've used in there, they do, it's sort of, I think they're using whoever drafted that is using the Colorado model, which has a 3-tier approach, and it's by county. It's very different than what we have already established as a framework. It has 3 levels. The lowest level would basically adhere to 2 counties, Essex County and what's the second smallest? Grand Isle County. The highest amount would be for Chittenden County only, and then all other counties would be the middle level. And so it sort of blows my mind a little bit that nobody has looked at how much it's going to cost really to stand this thing up and run it, throughout the years, as well as what are we going to get, out of this.
A cost benefit analysis is what you're
Yes.
suggesting needs to be done.
And I can tell you, I've run some quick numbers, and based on what's in there right now, we are looking at conservatively, probably the maximum amount would be just over $1 million. I think it's much closer probably to $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 that we're going to get for revenue. Now, to stand it up, it's going to cost at least a couple FTEs that are going to be a couple $100,000 probably annually, plus getting 1111 permits and some of those folks on board. So we're starting to push up against 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, and we're getting back to that same analysis that we did.
1111.
Well, any new infrastructure, that's how they come in through the agency, is through the 1111 permit process. So anytime there's a change, and because again, this is based on a foot distance. So anytime there's a change in a line, what's the new distance? If there's a new line, how does that get added on?
Okay, then 1111.
But they're already doing that. We're not changing that.
They're doing that, but the big problem with all this is they're not separating out telecommunications and other types of wired lines. The other thing with this statute, the language in the statute that's sort of being considered is there's a lot of waivers. It doesn't apply to everybody. So
Determine whose line, et cetera.
And are you getting down to the point where, and again, $1 million would be for everybody in all of our right of way. And when we start peeling that away, I think we're starting to get back to the point where is it really worth it? And these dollars to stand this up are dollars that we could be leveraging federal funds for. And obviously, if we're spending $1 to get 2 back, that would be fine. But I think we're getting very close to spending $1 and getting $1 and maybe 5 cents back, or if we're lucky, get the $1 back.
So there shouldn't.
So in that cost benefit analysis of break even, we do have control over what the fee would be. So we could have, I'd like to see the math that you have, and if that fee was higher, then that would probably get to a place where this would generate the revenues. I would just argue if I personally owned a swath of 3,000 acres or 100 acres, and people were using my right-of-ways, and I was maintaining that land, and it was land that I was paying taxes on, I'd want something from those organizations. And this is just about collecting revenues from those that are using the resources. Right now, we have high property tax burdens, and this is a way for the organizations that are using our right-of-ways to contribute to the cost of owning, maintaining, and overseeing it, that it just seems reasonable to collect something. As for how much that is and the factors, I also could be resolved to just strike this statute so that we're not,
You're
in
quite
violation of
obsessed
it.
by the auditor's findings, I would say.
I feel like he deserves a response.
Well,
No?
I guess, but I guess what is showing what seemed to be quite simple on the surface is much more complicated. And the other thing is, what we're talking about is ultimately, it's still gonna come back because it's an operating cost, and the extent to which those poles and wires are supporting a public good, like getting electricity, like broadband, et cetera, you look at them differently than, some other kind of entity. So like businesses that could use your private property. So I think that in some ways, there's been some injection of the public good and where the cost and ultimately what would you gain from doing it? So if you gain 5 cents on a dollar and it's translated, well, I think it would even be complicated because the waivers don't apply to telecommunications or would apply to copper.
We'd have to see that.
Yeah, it seems
Mr.
like.
Reed has a comment. And
So it just seems like maybe we need to clean up the language. If in fact something was done without all this deliberation or with the benefit of what the House is going to send us, but this idea of a 3-tier seems to add even more complexity to something that's already fairly complex.
It does, even to the fact that, it gives rates in that draft, but there's no discussion of escalator clauses or how to manage this in the future. And I don't think we want to come back here every year to figure out whether we want to update numbers or not. I think the statute would be better served if there was a process for the agency to basically establish and deal with. And I understand your point, Senator, about a response. I definitely do.
Right. Well, Mr. Reed has.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. Jeremy Reed for DTrans. So to Senator Chitten's point, yes, auditor deserves a response. We have multiple drafts. It's unclear why we never sent those. So in the next couple of weeks, let's say, we will formally respond to that report and lay out our thinking. Just absolutely fair point that response.
That's good. And I think at the very least, we should clarify the language because I think the different paragraphs are a little contradicting or can be seen that way. So.
Or maybe the ones below it negate the first one.
Right, we should clarify, and we are to prioritize what we want to do. Senator Ingles.
And the reason I can't jump on that bandwagon with Senator Chittenden and is that I just know ultimately who's going to bear the cost of any fees that we collect anyways. It's going to go to the least people that we're trying to push the last mile of broadband to, that we can't get there. And we're already subsidizing costs to get those, to make sure that once we get the service to them, that they can afford it. It does rub me the wrong way a little bit that some of what we're doing in there, that some people are benefiting for no charge by making monies on some of the right-of-way stuff, by pole connections and all of that stuff. That does grate me a little bit, but I have to believe at the end of the day that that's factored into their operating models of how they are going to supply at an equitable rate the services that they're providing using our right-of-way. So I get what you're saying. I get it. I think it's just at the end of the day, just as easy to strike that language out of there and not have business again.
Well, when you guys respond to the auditor, if you have any suggestions for changes to the statute that you feel would clarify it, make it easier, then I think that we'd be interested in seeing that.
Okay.
Mr. Thompson, you were on the agenda. Did you have it? Are you just here to be a resource, or did you have testimony to give?
I can speak if you'd like me to speak. Hunter Thompson.
Yeah, well, let's just see if are you done, Rob?
Yeah, also.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Come on.
Not pushing this, just so like, I feel like
You want to clean up the
it was
statute.
addressed to us. I just don't.
I did a little bit of Tommy Tax going there.
So for the record, Hunter Thompson, the Public Service Department Director of Telecommunications and Connectivity. Worked with Rob on this a little bit. Only been in this role for about a year, but we continue to assert at the Public Service Department. Clay Purvis.
Yeah.
Where is he?
He went to the NTIA, I believe, and now he's
It's
doing
a
federal
regional
level.
association, kind of doing the same kind of work, but on a regional basis.
Yeah, I think for Vermont, New Hampshire.
Okay.
And I wrote the memo, which states that, where is it? I'll only read the interesting parts. Basically says, memo explains the involvement of the Public Service Department in a waiver process for fees related to the use of the state-owned right-of-way for telecommunication and cable providers. 19 VSA 26A states that the Agency of Transportation may waive such charge if the provider offers to provide comparable value to the state as determined by the agency and the Department of Public Service. In recent years, the department has maintained that the term comparable value to the state is broadly interpreted as applying to the goal of furthering universal broadband and wireless in Vermont. We'll go on and talk about the snowballs. We talked about some of the math and the calculus, and I did some of that napkin math as it relates to the fees that are proposed.
Is this a memo that you sent us, or?
I send this to the Commissioner of Public Service.
Okay.
I am not sure what she does with that after that.
Okay, have you seen it?
Yes.
So keep in mind, this is just completely napkin math. Kind of with Rob's estimate, I came up with the same $1 million that would potentially be gleaned from charging the right of way that's currently in the statute. I think it's gonna make it back in its way.
Assuming no waivers?
Assuming no waivers, yeah. I think it actually came out to $1,012,000 when I got down to the nitty gritty.
And this is all on telecommunications.
This is all on
So it would
telecommunications.
do nothing for the electric companies then?
Correct. The current draft or the draft amendment in H 657 is going to exempt small communication service providers, the CUDs, cable television providers, utilities, electric utilities, as well as the communication infrastructure that electric utilities
Well, what's
use for
left?
grid resilience. What's left is telecom. Is a couple of the larger telecom providers. in the
Like
state.
Comcast?
Nope, Comcast is cable. Comcast would be
Oh,
This is
like,
the consolidated
like
communication.
consolidated
Consolidated.
communications.
and they're so healthy economically.
Right, and they're gonna be bought,
Merged, I believe.
merged.
I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it too much,
Sure,
but
sure.
yeah, there's a petition in front of the Public Utilities Commission for the merger of Consolidated Communications with Searchlight at the moment. I was told not to talk about it.
Yeah, we won't force you.
A pending
Sure.
docket. So basically the napkin math came up that given the current cost of fiber, with that $1 million, you could build about 18 miles of fiber with that every year. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but then you figure how many actual strands of fiber are in a cable. 48 is what was done years and years ago. Most likely there's 144 strands. So that's potentially 4,600 drops of fiber that could go to people if this continued to be exempt. If it was only 48 strands, it's 1,500 drops. So then I talked to the VCBB, and the average number of drops per mile, if you take the whole state, aggregate it together and divide it by the number of miles of road that we need to serve, is 22. So that means that 18 miles of fiber that could be built if this was not implemented could impact nearly 400 people, 396 people who previously did not have access to fiber, could have access to fiber on an annual basis.
And that's if you get all the money, not kind of
That's if you get
costs.
every penny, and
Yeah.
it costs nothing to administer the program.
Right.
That's like the pie in the sky scenario. So, I would leave it with kind of a rhetorical question, say, I guess a question of value to the state would largely depend on if you were one of those 400 people who got access to the fiber by this being waived. The other benefit is that those unused strands of fiber are now available to lease to others for wireless backhaul in the event that we are able to find tower providers to fill in the gaps, as well as direct connections for public and private network use and other telecommunication uses, like I think AOT rents some fiber from some of these providers to do the town garage network, as well as private companies that can rent this fiber to do direct connections to data centers and other uses.
So those lines are bi-directional or?
Yeah, absolutely, yep. So we at the Public Service Department, just to read that part again, continue to maintain that the term comparable value to the state is broadly interpreted as applying to the goal of furthering universal broadband and wireless in Vermont. We have spoke out against this since it's come up this session, so I feel like that's what I'm doing again. I don't disagree the auditor needs a response, but that's on Rob to put together. We
No, a
just
lot
tell-
of it's about the application and how you're interpreting the provisions of the existing law. And I mean, with the background.
The auditor says this is rendering the statute currently useless, so I don't know, maybe I feel like we clean up statutes all the time.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. I think it's warrant for cleanup for sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's helpful.
Although it sounds interesting if the House is putting together some kind of grade
But that
structure.
tier thing was in bill, so then they took it out in energy, and now you're saying a floor amendment is being prepared, that's your understanding?
For the right of way?
The bills and appropriation.
Yeah, the right of way portion of that, it's a very large bill with the different sections, and that portion that was for the right of way was struck. But it was my understanding from Ways and Means that there would be amendment on the floor to put it back in.
Although then that is revisiting the whole determination around the public benefit that, right now, the extent you weigh that or, that influences whether there's 3 tiers or 29 tiers, whether in fact you would want to, generate revenues in this particular way.
So I believe it was struck before because it had, it was missing parts about critical infrastructure. So the amendment includes some parts that specifically exempt the telecommunication networks used by the power providers for great resiliency, as well as puts in some provisions to protect it from necessarily being public information, because of the fact of what is connected to a pole can be interpreted as critical infrastructure, depending on what piece of communication infrastructure is there.
Then it's a pitifully small tax base by the time you get done.
So I don't disagree. Yeah.
Almost non-existent.
Right, which makes it difficult to cover the costs if you're narrowing it down, so great, I guess synergy.
I saw Logan nodding his head at some point, so we've heard the $1 million estimate. Has a JFO note been proposed or contemplated on any of this discussion in the House?
There's a fiscal note, yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. I believe JFO's hesitant to put out a number just because there are so many exemptions and unknowns. It will be a positive number, but I don't think JFO's comfortable saying what that number is. If you do the straight, here's the number of miles we have with the charge, it is somewhere around $1 million. But there, again, there's a lot of exemptions and unknowns related to what that actual number will be.
And Hunter or Rob, do we have the data? I thought, remember at one point there was some concern that we didn't really know.
But we don't really know actually how many lines, where they are exactly. We have to do some work with the companies to determine where that is. But what we did, and it was alluded to, is we have all our road mileage across the state for every town. And so we assumed that if there was 1 foot of fiber for every foot of roadway in the state, and we put those charges against them, it comes up to just slightly over $1 million.
But
So
that, in fact, that may be overstating.
way overstating,
By
I
using that
believe.
methodology,
Yeah.
because I bet not every foot is in the right of way.
Right, we know we have interstate that doesn't have fiber optic in it running, along it. We know there's exemptions in that statute, so it starts to bring that number down very quickly, but we don't know where it bottoms out. But as I was trying to portray, that's coming down and the cost is coming up and they're starting to get very close, and we don't know if there is.
You know, the
That's
old
good.
saying,
Down there.
reminds me of a saying, squeeze a beggar, catch a louse. It seems like maybe that's what we're going.
That's a new one, I haven't heard
Oh,
that.
no.
Yeah, we're still getting new ones.
Yes,
Mhm.
but we haven't heard all that.
No,
And Senator Kitchell raised a great point. Even if you're in the right of way, you may cut the corner across private property and not be in our right of way. So there's an administrative hurdle here for the telecom company to report to us exactly how many feet are in our right of way. So, every sort of time you look at the specifics, it continues to lower that number.
In addition to that hurdle, a lot of the telecom connections are on Green Mountain Power poles at this point. Consolidated.
it's shared,
Sold
it's
its
all shared.
pole,
Yeah.
And now it's on Green Mountain Power, so you have kind of two sources of truths. You have a consolidated number and you have a Green Mountain Power number.
So that's part of
Adds to the
the
community.
staff, part of would just be doing all that work ahead of time to figure out the exact.
So if you,
And
if you had a poll that in fact is supporting both a wavered and a non-wavered, how do I guess
non-waiver gets charged.
the non-waiver gets charged, yeah.
And to Senator Chitten's point, it doesn't really cost us anything. Once the pole's there, GMP's not any less burdensome to us than consolidating, let's say. Right, so as far as the expense to V-Trans to maintain that right of way, the pole is the issue, not the entities that are attached to it.
Okay. I just want to be able to look the auditor straight in the eye and say we took up his letter and that there's some response and progress on the concerns he raised.
He owes you dinner.
He owes all of us dinner after this.
But you are gonna write up a letter.
We will, and we'll be sure to copy this.
And then we can get, maybe there's other legislative changes that the auditor's office would want to suggest to make it clearer as well. So we could put that in, so. Okay. Maybe the last time we talked
See you
about
next
that. We'll talk about it. The letter will generate a whole bunch.
Seriously, we'll get low on our schedule. Hey, let's get the Red Wing people back.
Okay. Michelle, do you want to talk to us about reports? Unless there's anything else about right away.
Thank you, guys.
And then Jeremy, you were going to talk to us about something else.
The 10G reports.
Oh, thank you.
And also, design standards, what really, design standards.
Right, which we could have you come back to that.
So,
Michelle deferred to you on that.
so I'm just going to use as reference Donna's memo to you about the reports. She divided them in 4 tiers. And, I believe that you made your way through this last week. That's okay. And indicated which reports you wanted to preserve and which reports you were going to depart with. And other than the 10G language that's in the T-bill currently, which Jeremy can speak to, we had no concerns about the direction you were taking with the report sections update. And we like the direction of reducing the number of reports as we continue to think about the T-bill going forward.
That is a good one.
Legacy law. What do you want to name after Jane Kitchell?
Well, I have a bench made by Correctional Industries over at the Agency of Human Services with a little plaque. I think that's probably sufficient.
Janeville. I want to rename Danville Janeville.
Don't need to have.
I heard you have another earmark
I
coming.
actually just sold the house.
Really?
Kitchell Hill.
Yeah, well, that was because my husband's family,
Yeah,
the Stone House,
yeah.
owned that, and so it got named
The house or the hill?
the Hill.
Yeah, I just
The
looked at
house
that.
was one of the original, built by Scottish settlers, I believe Gilkersons, and it's one of the few that actually the architecture is exactly what it would be in Scotland. And I mean, Water Andrick is a name of a stream in Scotland. So somebody in the state government a few years ago wanted to change it to Andrick Brook. I mean, that was like blasphemous because Water Andrick is very much Scottish. And then of course it's a big Presbyterian, presence in Barnet and Peacham. And so it's kind of an interesting, and Kilfasset Farms was named. There's a site in Kilfasset of Caledonia, of course, is right there as well. And
The Hood Farm, is that a Hood Farm, Is that anything?
Hood.
Yeah,
the Hoods,
yeah,
yeah,
just sold one of their property, whatever.
yeah, down the
Across from the
road.
barn, actually from across from the barn.
So that was, but it's very interesting, and they selected that simply because it looks so similar to Scotland, and where they were counting some of the settlers. And there's still families from the original settlers, the McLarens. It used to be McElroy, the Roys, that big farm, Wardens, and they're still on those properties generations later. That's a little bit of regional history, and there's also outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, an area called Caledonia. That's where Thaddeus Stevens actually had a presence. Of course, he was born in Danville. He's reviled was in the South because he was in Reconstruction. But yes, so that's part of some.
Now we know that.
Yeah.
Okay, did you have anything else? You just wanted to?
I just wanted to take a tour
She
down.
just wanted to defer my attention.
Thank you.
And my grandmother, somebody said something about a man being a native, and she said, well, he's not a native, he's from Barnet.
That's funny. That's a good.
You like that one?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad somebody's laughing. I don't know. This weekend can't come soon enough. So what are we on to now? Reports?
10G reports. So I saw some of the testimony and discussion from, I think, yesterday. And so I'll try to address some of the questions.
Was it a specific section in the bill, or we?
Section 8, I think it is.
Right.
Oh, I got out my report thing. Oh, I need to go back to the bill.
Because section 8 changes the 10G reports a little bit.
Correct.
Yeah, I think Senator Kitchell in particular had some
I did?
comments.
I don't know. Trying to find, what page is that?
16, 17?
17?
Or even maybe you can start some. Where does it start?
I don't know.
14, 15?
Oh, it starts on 12, actually,
It's
section.
long. Oh, and that has to do with, yeah, even, we were having a hard time for the district where the affected project
Yeah.
is located, and whatever. And notify the legislators for the district where the affected project is located.
14.
Okay, so what were you gonna tell us?
So really our area of interest starts on page 14. And just make a couple observations. They've obviously lowered the thresholds from the existing 10G reports. And I would just offer that, you know, the lower the thresholds, the more projects are going to be on that report, and to what value does that, you know, lose? And
That's my question,
and-
not yours.
well, and so, you know, just to go back to earlier in the year, I did testify to the fact that prices are getting more. So I'm not sure when the initial thresholds were established, but certainly $8 million doesn't get us what we used to. So even without lowering the thresholds, you're going to see a lot
So
more.
you would recommend at least maintaining the 8 million?
That would be our recommendation.
They lower the percentage to.
They did. So
They love reports.
So, you know, obviously a lot of this is from the auditor's report, and I just quickly reread that this morning, and he does have a suggestion for a dollar threshold, but not necessarily a time, I think it is. And so what we would offer is that, you know, we keep the same thresholds, and if there is something specific that the auditor thought we needed, we could provide that. But to just lower the thresholds and almost encapsulate every project doesn't make a lot of sense. Additionally, they added a provision which establishes a reporting threshold based on not the previous year, but the initial program estimate. And I think something that the auditor's report mentions, but doesn't fully appreciate, that initial programming estimate is without any real information. We haven't done any geotechnical investigation.
So that was a suggestion by the auditor, not in the bill.
No, it's in the bill as well. So
Where's that?
trend 3.
On that same page 14.
Yeah.
50% from the estimate adopted in the transportation. So what you're saying is.
But I wondered, on this part, it's front of the book. It's different than in the book.
Well, I think the initial estimate's the same, right? So I think the auditor's intent when he proposed this was to say, okay, your initial estimate, let's just say, is $5 million. You increase $300,000 a year over 4 years, you've exceeded.
But it doesn't say initial estimate, it says
First appears as front of the book. I think we need to.
first
understand.
appears as the front, because I had
And if it first appears as the D&E,
Yeah.
well, but the D&E isn't in the front of the book, it's in the back of the book. So does that matter?
Well, so it does, but our initial preliminary engineering estimate would be in the front of the book. Correct, Rob? Yes.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The initial estimate is what came about before it was even in the book, probably.
But it doesn't say initial. I get why you think that, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't say initial estimate.
But I think it would carry forward.
Yeah, that's what
We wouldn't develop a new estimate to put it in the front of the book.
but so it's a language wrong when the project first appears as a front of the book project. So would that have a better estimate than just the preliminary engineering estimate that you're saying is just so preliminary. So maybe we should change the terminology to something that is a little later in the process.
I'm not even too sure where the back of the book starts.
Well, me either.
like the D&E projects. I don't know where they even are in the book.
Well, preliminary engineering is the first column. Yeah.
That's
Right, so-
there isn't like a tab for those projects.
Well, so the front of the book, right, is the breakdown after where the projects are listed after the first handful of pages in each program.
Each program has a front of a book and a back of the book?
Each program has a front of the book.
Where's the back of the book? Like what part of the book would you consider not the front?
So as I understand it, and I don't know that this is.
Statute is a strange.
Right. So if you pull open a program, any program.
Right.
The initial couple pages, so just flip one more page.
Right, yeah,
So that is, what you see there is not front of the book, as I understand it.
okay,
If you keep flipping,
yeah.
when you get to the projects, that's the front of the book.
I thought each line in here was in here.
I don't think so.
No.
It should be.
It could be,
The
but it's
numbers
not.
should add up. The numbers, if the white book is not correct, how I understand it, the numbers that are listed there should also correspond. There could be extra projects in the
Exactly.
back section, but all the projects that are on those sheets should also be on the back
Correct,
sheets.
but there are
But
projects,
there could be extra projects that aren't receiving funds this year that are still
Exactly.
active projects in those back sheets.
So I hope
You're
you're
saying these are
following.
the front of this is the back of the book and this is the front, even though the front
as
is
it's been
after the
explained to
back?
me, correct?
That's confusing.
We don't even have a statutory definition in front of the book. So we're making reference to something nobody even knows what it is, obviously.
Especially when the front of the book is behind the back of the
Got a
book.
report on it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we're happy to fund a study for it.
So, but that is my understanding that these pages are the more detailed information. And like, I thought they were all in here, but sometimes it's just zeros because we haven't gotten past this
So-
P and E estimate.
Right, and so the estimate there could be with very little information.
Yeah,
And if we use that as the benchmark for the entire project, given inflation, permitting, and just all the things that linked in a project, it could be a very voluminous list if we reference that initial front of the book estimate.
and well, first of all, we're gonna change that reference.
Okay. The other thing I would offer is that, the auditor references a federal highway report, which basically tries to articulate the need to have good estimates. But even that federal highway report says the earlier you are in the process, the more subjectivity there is and the more unknowns. And so that report goes on to say, you can provide a range for an estimate or provide a level of confidence with that estimate to sort of, I won't say hedge, but just identify the fact that there are a lot of unknowns through the normal process. The other point that I would make is that the chief estimator, right, that we're bringing on, we think that that position will be advertised this week, and some of the guidance we've gotten from the CFO. So some of the guidance we've gotten from the CFO are looking at the CPI and PPI on those out years to try to make those estimates a little better. But, we're still trying to do our best guess. We don't want to get too conservative with those estimates because, even with our best guess, let's just say we hit the average, 50% maybe over and 50% maybe under, but that doesn't necessarily create an inherent flaw in our estimating. So if the goal is to never have a project exceed $5 million, the natural driver would be to overestimate the costs of all these projects and to overestimate the schedule duration for these projects, which I don't think achieves the goal.
It's amazing how recommendations can end up with a perverse response. This might be one of them.
Yes, and I would just also, I think the auditor, from my perspective, was looking at each project as a standalone issue, right? So if we've got a IT project, right? It's very defined. It's not really dependent on other issues. It's not looking at the network. And so establishing performance measures for that specific IT project makes some sense. But establishing performance measures on a project level when we're trying to manage to the network and to the program doesn't necessarily make sense. And I'll just use one example. If we need to program a project, let's just take a generic paving project, and we say, hey, we think in 3 or 4 years, we may need to do a paving project on this road. But for whatever reason, the road holds up. To meet schedule, we wouldn't want to do that project when we originally anticipated. If the project, or if the road's in good shape, we do want to delay that project, right? And so that doesn't necessarily indicate a failure of performance. That's just good stewardship of not paving over what could be a good asset.
Okay. And the same thing could be said that if you were going and all of a sudden a road got in disrepair and you were in that area already and say, hey, while we're here, let's put that other one on hold because we have everybody here. So let's tackle that project now. And
or just lengthening the project we are doing. I think, the auditor looked at 14 paving projects, which is a very small sample size. And one of the projects, I think we increased the miles paved by 433%, which was the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean we failed to perform, right? We would have violated all performance measures, but it's not, again, you're not looking at a discrete project to gauge performance.
So we would probably benefit from some recommended
Language. Yeah, if you guys have language for those, that subsection 2 and 3.
Maybe we could get away
On
in
page
front of the
14.
book or something.
Yeah, it would be better, maybe we just say, I don't know if there's better wording about the transportation program.
After completion of preliminary engineering or something that you're setting a different time within that very fluid.
Yeah.
The front or the back.
Right.
In discussion with the House, right, they were trying to achieve 2 objectives. One was this, what we'll call project scope or creep, and then one was the spike. And so if there is an interest, which is essentially what Friend 3 does, to look at that creep, we'd be happy to sort of try to provide some recommendations. But again, that initial starting point is pretty preliminary. So
well, that would be our recommendation. Your recommendation would be to look at a recommendation of what do we don't use the word preliminary estimation, but maybe the construction estimate or whatever wording it is at one point where it's a little more solid. Maybe something for the chief estimator to come up with.
I mean, we can provide, I don't know, we were talking initially, the auditor referenced Virginia, and Virginia, from my understanding, doesn't really assign a number until preliminary claims, right? Which is certainly well after this, but
Well, maybe
we could do something.
You guys
like
know
that.
better when you get a better number, but that still allows us to track when there's a problem.
Sure.
Okay.
did you go to engineering college for this?
Well, not specifically for this, but for engineering.
Oh, speaking of that, the design standards.
Oh.
I think we're gonna have to come back. People have some new meetings.
Design
I have to have
standards
Jeremy
on
to come
hold.
back. Talk about design.
yeah, when we talk about right of ways again, we'll bring that up.
Yeah.
And just for clarity, design standards or those Vermont state standards that are being developed?
Well,
We thought they were the same.
Not necessarily.
Maybe that's part of.
Well,
it.
whatever's in here, that's what
There's.
you update your standards, your design standards.
That's the Vermont state standards, yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe you could tell us what the difference is of the Vermont state standards and the design standards.
So quickly, design standards could be anything like, how we look at the design of a bridge, not necessarily the width of it, right? So a lot of this stuff comes from AASHTO, where you use different trucks and different weights and different distributions as an example. That could be a design standard, whereas the Vermont state standards, I think, are more looking at, okay, in this context, you should have a bike lane, you should have 12-foot lanes and 10-foot shoulders or whatever.
Yeah,
And
I think
pavement of,
we're only interested in the latter. We're not gonna get into the federal.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think with that, unless there's any last comments, we're gonna go out